This is not an accident. The street, the lawn, the distance between this house and the next one, and the one after that, spreading out across the landscape as far as you care to drive. None of this is an accident. In the years after the Second World War, the United States government made a decision. Not loudly, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small policy decisions, in highway bills and zoning codes and mortgage guarantees, that the American people should be spread out, away from the cities, away from the density, away from the places that would, in the event of a nuclear strike, simply cease to exist. The suburbs were not prosperity. They were, at least in part, a strategy. And into this landscape, at the precise moment when the United States government was doing the math on blast radii and fallout patterns, and how many Americans might survive a Soviet strike, came a man with a solution. His solution was not a bunker. It was not a fallout shelter. It was not an evacuation plan. His solution was shopping malls. This is a story how the American mall grew up as a national security structure and how its existence transformed culture in America for 60 years. In 1945, two major cities did not exist anymore. Not damaged, not wounded, gone. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown the world something it could not unsee, that a single weapon delivered by a single plane could erase a city and everyone in it in a matter of seconds. And within 4 years, the Soviet Union had the capability to do that as well. The United States government understood immediately what this meant for American cities. New York, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, dense, concentrated, industrial, exactly the kind of targets that made strategic sense. Exactly the kind of places that, in a nuclear exchange, would be priorities. The question was not whether American cities would be targeted. The question was what to do about the tens of millions of Americans who lived in them. One answer was dispersion. If you spread the population out, thin it across the landscape, away from the obvious targets, away from the density, you change the math. You make the country harder to destroy all at once. You preserve, in theory, enough of the population and enough of the industrial base to survive and perhaps to fight back. This was not a fringe idea. It was federal policy. The interstate highway system, signed into law by Eisenhower in 1956, was sold to Congress partly on exactly these grounds. The official name was the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. Defense. It was in the name. The highways would move troops and equipment. They would also, in the event of a nuclear attack on a major city, move people out. The American suburb, already growing rapidly on the back of post-war prosperity and the GI Bill, fit neatly into this logic. A family in a house 20 miles outside the city center was, from a civil defense standpoint, already better positioned than a family in an apartment building downtown. So the government helped. Mortgage guarantees favored new suburban construction. Highway dollars flowed toward the periphery. Zoning codes in hundreds of municipalities made density difficult and sprawl easy. The landscape being built across America in the late 1940s and 1950s was not only an economic story, it was a survival story. The two were so thoroughly intertwined that most Americans living inside it couldn't tell them apart, which made it the perfect moment for someone to propose something that sounded like commerce and functioned, at least partly, as something else entirely. The man who sold safety as shopping. His name was Victor Gruen, and he was not what you would expect. He was born in Vienna in 1903, the son of a lawyer, raised in a city that understood what it meant to have a genuine public life. Places where people gathered not because they had to, but because that was simply where life happened. Indoor, outdoor, commercial, social, all of it woven together into the fabric of the city. Gruen came to the United States in 1938, fleeing the Nazis. And what he found when he arrived disturbed him in a way he spent the rest of his career trying to fix. American cities were retreating, the suburbs were spreading, and the suburbs, as he saw them, had no center, no gathering place, no civic heart, just houses and cars and the space between them. He became an architect, and he became convinced that what America needed, what it was missing, was a new kind of public space, something that could do for the suburb what the town square had done for the city. A place that was inside and outside at once. A place with stores, yes, but also fountains and benches and greenery. A place where you might go to buy something and end up simply being somewhere. He called it the regional shopping center, and he was smart enough to know that a vision of civic utopia was not, on its own, going to get it built. So he learned to speak the language of the people who could. In the early 1950s, Gruen began framing his regional shopping centers not just as commercial ventures or civic amenities, but as civil defense infrastructure. The location outside dense urban targets, the reinforced concrete construction, the self-contained mechanical systems, the highway access that can move large numbers of people quickly. These weren't incidental features. In Gruen's pitch, they were the point. He wrote a memo, later cited by planning historians, explicitly connecting the regional shopping center to civilian defense needs. The mall in this framing was not just a place to buy things. It was a place to survive. Federal officials were listening. The National Fallout Shelter Survey, launched in the early 1960s, identified and designated thousands of existing structures as official fallout shelters. The criteria, large interior volume, reinforced construction, distance from likely targets, access and egress, described almost perfectly the regional shopping centers that were beginning to appear on the American periphery. Some were designated, some were stocked. Supplies were delivered, water drums, crackers, medical kits, sanitation equipment, and stored in the basements and service corridors of structures that, one floor up, were selling housewares and ladies' shoes. The clearest example was Southdale Center, which opened outside Minneapolis in 1956. Gruen's design was deliberately inward-facing, no windows on the exterior walls, a fully enclosed climate-controlled interior, reinforced concrete throughout. It was simultaneously the first fully enclosed regional shopping mall in America and a structure that met federal criteria for survivable public shelter. Most of the people who walked through its doors on opening day were thinking about neither of those things. They were thinking about shopping, which was, in a way, exactly the point. The promise in the basement. There is a document that most Americans have never heard of. It is called the National Fallout Shelter Survey. It was launched in 1961 under the Kennedy administration at the height of American anxiety about nuclear war, and its purpose was straightforward. Find every building in the United States that could protect a significant number of people from nuclear fallout. Mark it, stock it, and tell the public it was there. The criteria were specific. A qualifying shelter needed sufficient mass in its walls and ceiling to block radiation. It needed to hold at least 50 people. It needed to be accessible, and it needed to be, ideally, outside the zones of immediate destruction, which meant, in practice, outside the dense urban cores that would be primary targets. Over the following years, federal surveyors fanned out across the country. They measured walls, they calculated protection factors, they filled out forms, and when a building qualified, they put a sign on it, a black and yellow symbol, 3 triangles, pointing inward toward a central circle. That became one of the most quietly ubiquitous icons of Cold War America. You've seen that sign. You may not have known what it meant, but in a World War III scenario, those signs were supposed to mean safety. Hundreds of thousands of buildings were designated. Schools, churches, office towers, government buildings, and commercial structures, including, in a number of cases, the new regional shopping centers appearing on the American periphery. The stocking program followed. The federal government procured and distributed roughly 165,000 tons of supplies, water containers, high-calorie crackers, medical kits, sanitation equipment, and moved them into the basements and service areas of designated shelters across the country. The promise being made to the American people, quietly and without much fanfare, was this: if the worst happens, there's a place for you. We have thought about this. We have prepared. Go to the sign. It was not a perfect promise. The shelters were not evenly distributed, and the supplies were not always adequate, but there was an infrastructure. The planning assumed a kind of orderly crisis that nuclear war would almost certainly not provide, however, and the public, for the most part, received the program with a mixture of relief and deep unease, because acknowledging the shelter was acknowledging what the shelter was for. But the promise was real. In the basement of at least some of those buildings, next to the loading docks and the mechanical rooms, were drums of water and tins of crackers that the federal government had put there, just in case. The mall in this moment was not just a commercial institution. It was, in the most literal bureaucratic sense, part of the national survival infrastructure. But it wouldn't last. Expired. Nobody announced that the promise was over. There was no press conference, no executive order declaring that the American public was on its own. No memo circulated to the designated shelters telling them to throw out the crackers. The promise simply stopped being funded. By the mid-1960s, the federal procurement of shelter supplies had quietly wound down. The last significant purchases had been made. The supplies already distributed sat where they had been placed, in basements, in service corridors, in the back rooms of buildings whose tenants had no particular reason to think about them. And they sat, the water containers corroded, the crackers never particularly appetizing to begin with, reached and passed their expiration dates. The medical kits degraded, the sanitation equipment gathered dust. A program that had once represented a serious federal commitment to public survival was becoming, in practice, a maintenance problem that nobody wanted to pay for, and nobody wanted to publicly abandon. In 1969, the Nixon administration made it official, not with a declaration, but with a budget. Funding for shelter stocking was not renewed. The program did not end so much as it was allowed to expire, just like the crackers. A later Government Accountability Office review would describe what remained with a phrase that deserves to be remembered: abandoned in place. That is what the promise looked like by the early 1970s. Still in the maps, still marked with the black and yellow signs on thousands of buildings across the country, but hollowed out, unfunded, unmanaged. A bureaucratic ghost. Part of what killed it was money. Maintaining a national shelter stocking program required sustained appropriations, local compliance, ongoing logistics, all for an asset that provided no visible benefit in normal times and that nobody wanted to think about. But part of what killed it was something deeper. The theory of survival was changing. In the early years of the nuclear age, the dominant assumption was that survival meant staying put. You built hardened structures, you stocked them, you got people inside, and you waited out the worst. Shelter was the answer. But by the late 1960s and into the 1970s, that assumption was being quietly revised. The weapons had gotten bigger, much bigger. The missiles had gotten more accurate. The idea that a reinforced concrete building could protect a civilian population from a direct strike, or even from the fallout of multiple strikes across a wide area, was looking less and less credible. The new theory was movement, crisis relocation. If you had enough warning, and the assumption was that you would, days perhaps, you move people. You use the highways. You disperse the urban population into host areas in the countryside, away from the targets, and you manage the emergency from there. This was notably the same interstate highway system that had been built partly on defense grounds in the first place. The roads that had helped justify suburban dispersal were now the backbone of a new survival theory. You did not shelter in place, you simply drove away. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, created in 1979, inherited and formalized this framework. The Reagan administration invested in it. Civil defense was being revitalized, but the revitalized version looked nothing like the shelter program of the early 1960s. It looked like evacuation planning. It looked like continuity of government. It looked like the assumption that the state would survive even if the cities did not. The mall in this new doctrine had no particular role. It was not an evacuation route. It was not a government continuity facility. It was simply a building, a very large, very accessible, very well-stocked building, sitting on a highway interchange, full of supplies that were being rotated and replenished every single day by the ordinary mechanisms of commercial logistics. But nobody in the federal government was calling it that. Nobody needed to. The machine that didn't need a reason. The mall did not need the government anymore. That is the part of the story that gets lost when you focus on the civil defense angle. The shelter program, the federal designation, the crackers in the basement, that version of the story makes it sound like the mall was a creature of the state, depended on federal logic for its existence and its meaning. It wasn't. Not anymore, at least. By the early 1970s, the forces driving mall construction had almost nothing to do with blast radii or fallout protection factors. They had to do with money, with roads, with the particular economics of anchor tenants and inline stores, and the way a Sears at one end of a building and a JCPenney at the other could generate enough foot traffic to make the 40 stores in between viable. They had to do with the American automobile and the American suburb, and the fact that by 1970 there were millions of families living in places that had no downtown, no town square, no civic center, nothing, in fact, that functioned as a gathering place except the mall. They had to do with national retail chains that had figured out how to replicate themselves across the country, moving into standardized spaces and standardized buildings, running standardized operations that could be managed from a corporate headquarters 1,000 miles away. The mall was not just a place to shop. It was a distribution center, a logistics platform, a mechanism for moving goods from manufacturers to consumers at a scale and efficiency that had never existed before. And they had to do with tax law. Commercial real estate in this period carried significant tax advantages, depreciation schedules, and passive loss provisions that made mall development attractive to investors well beyond whatever the underlying retail economics might justify. Money flowed into mall construction not only because malls were profitable, but because the act of building them was, under the right circumstances, its own financial reward. The federal government had not planned any of this, but the federal government had built the conditions for all of it. The highways were federal. The mortgage guarantees that filled the suburbs with families who needed somewhere to shop were federal. The zoning frameworks that made large commercial developments on the suburban periphery straightforward were shaped at every level by federal policy priorities that stretched back to the post-war period. The infrastructure outlived the ideology that had partly justified it, and into that structure, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the mall kept growing. The numbers are almost difficult to absorb. In 1956, the year Southdale opened, there were a handful of enclosed regional shopping centers in the United States. By 1975, there were roughly 16,000 shopping centers of various kinds. By the mid-1980s, that number was still climbing, and the enclosed regional mall had become so dominant a feature of the American landscape that it was difficult to remember a time before it existed. It became a place for everybody. Teenagers colonized it, not because anyone planned for teenagers, but because the mall was climate controlled and free to enter and full of other teenagers, and because the alternative was outside, which in Minnesota in February was not a serious alternative. The food court appeared. The multiplex movie theater moved in. The mall acquired all the functions of a town center. The place where you ran into people you knew, where you spent a Saturday afternoon, where you marked the passage of time by the seasonal decorations and the annual arrival of a man in a red suit and a chair near the fountain. The civil defense logic that had helped justify the first generation of these buildings was not present in any of this. It was not in the leasing agreements or the anchor tenant negotiations or the passive loss calculations or the teenage social dynamics playing out near the Orange Julius. It had been composted into the ordinary life of the institution. The mall had become, without anyone quite deciding that this was what it was, the default interior of American life, the living stockpile. But here's the thing about the mall in the 1980s that nobody was saying out loud. It was, by almost any functional measure, exactly what the civil defense planners of the 1960s had been trying to build. Not because anyone planned it that way. Not because FEMA had a memo somewhere that said shopping centers were the new fallout shelters. But because the problems that the shelter program had been trying to solve, where do you put large numbers of people? How do you keep them fed and supplied? How do you maintain access and logistics in an emergency? The mall had solved all of them, quietly, in the process of becoming the most efficient retail distribution system in American history. Think about what a regional shopping mall actually was in 1985. It was a climate-controlled interior space large enough to hold thousands of people. It had multiple access points and enormous parking capacity. It had loading docks designed for continuous, high-volume supply delivery. It had generators and mechanical systems and centralized HVAC. It had food, it had water, it had clothing and medicine, and batteries and everything else that the federal government had once tried to pre-position in shelter basements at significant public expense. Except none of this was expiring. None of it was corroding in a drum. None of it required a federal appropriation to maintain. It was all being restocked continuously, automatically, by the ordinary mechanisms of commercial supply chains that existed for entirely different reasons. The shelter crackers had lasted maybe 5 years before they became a maintenance problem, and then an embarrassment, and then a line item that nobody wanted to defend in a budget hearing. The Kroger, however, restocked itself every 3 days. FEMA's planning language in the 1980s had shifted, quietly and without much public attention, toward what it called mass care, the provision of shelter, food, and essential supplies to large numbers of people in an emergency using existing facilities. Reception centers, staging areas, distribution points for essential goods. The guidance did not say shopping malls. It said existing large structures with adequate access and logistical capacity. It did not need to say shopping malls. There was only one kind of building in America that met all of those criteria and could be found by the mid-1980s within a short drive of almost every significant population center in the country. The government had spent the 1960s trying to build a national network of provision survival nodes, and it failed. The program was too expensive. The supplies expired. The public was not particularly reassured. The whole effort had been abandoned in place. Literally. Bureaucratically composted, left to rot alongside the crackers. And then, without anyone intending it, the private market had built exactly that network anyway. Not as survival nodes, as shopping destinations. Civil defense did not disappear in America. It got privatized. It got absorbed into the normal functioning of the commercial economy. Invisible, unacknowledged, and more effective than the original program had ever been. The mall was not a bunker anymore. It was something stranger than a bunker. It was a bunker that paid for itself. A bunker that teenagers wanted to hang out in. A bunker with a food court and a Walden Books and a man in a red suit at Christmas. Just Tuesday. It's a Tuesday in 1986. The mall is full. Not dramatically full. Not a holiday crowd. Not a back-to-school Saturday either. Just full in the ordinary way that malls were full back in 1986. which is to say that there are enough people moving through it that it feels like the center of the universe, like the place where things are happening, or at least where things could happen, if anything were going to happen that day. A woman is returning something at the Montgomery wards. 2 teenagers are sitting on a bench near the fountain, doing nothing in particular, and that suits them just fine. Someone's eating a pretzel. Someone else is looking at shoes they will probably not buy. The HVAC hums. The skylights let in a version of the afternoon that has been filtered and softened until it feels like no particular time of day. Nobody here is thinking about blast radii. There's a sale at Walden Books. Copies of a new book out by Rick Smolin is propped up on a display, A Day in the Life of America. It's photographs taken across America by different photographers on the same day. I'd be surprised if there wasn't a picture of a shopping mall in it. Nobody's thinking about Victor Gruen, who by this point has been dead for 7 years, who spent the last years of his life publicly disowning the mall and blaming American commercialism for turning his vision of civic space into something he no longer recognized. But if you walk toward the JCPenney's, you'll find children riding on one of those indoor train rides that appear at almost every mall. Nobody is thinking about the fallout shelter survey, or the crackers that rotted in the basement, or the black and yellow signs that are still bolted to the walls of thousands of buildings across the country, weathering slowly. Their meaning legible now only to people old enough to remember what they were for back in the day. Toward the center, they have a Nintendo on display that has accumulated quite a line of kids looking to give it a try. But nobody's thinking about the interstate highway system as a defense project, or about dispersal theory, or about the specific federal policy decisions that put this building at this interchange in the suburb rather than somewhere else, or nowhere at all. The fear that helped build this place has been completely absorbed into the support beams and concrete walls. But somewhere in Washington this same year, a piece of legislation is moving through Congress. It's on a seemingly dry subject. It is very long and very boring, and has nothing obviously to do with shopping malls. Nobody at the food court has heard of it. Nobody at the food court would care if they had. The mall is full on this Tuesday in 1986, in a way that things are full just before they are no longer full, which is to say completely and without awareness of what comes next. Without anyone knowing, the mall was about to experience its first shock wave, but not from any nuclear blast. But the shock wave, along with the others that followed, would destroy the American mall, all the same. This story, however, will have to be told in a separate episode. For now, it's 1986. The people are still shopping. As for me, I think I might go check out Walden Books. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. I enjoy making all my episodes. And if you want to help me continue, if you want to help me keep building, keep working, keep researching, understand what's going on in our world, and kind of dissect how we got from point A to point B, point C to point D to where we are now. So I'd like to ask you to do 1, 2, or maybe all 3 of these things. First, please subscribe if you haven't already. Second, leave me a comment. Feedback's always great, even if it's to say, hey, I didn't like this part, or you know what, you could do better by doing X or Y or whatever. That's helpful. And then finally, if you want to be more direct, provide a little bit more feedback that might have a little more bite, but you don't want to put it in a public space, you could email me, jeremy@plainmeaning.com. Even if it's just to say hi.